our November procurement talk. We've had quite a year. I know that here in California, we are now back in the purple tier, which means no holidays, no get-togethers, don't do anything inside. On top of that, we've had a storm coming in, so hopefully we'll get some sunshine. It looks like Eric in New York has nicer weather than we do here in California. This is a series that we launched last year with the goal of bringing the procurement community together to network and to collaborate and share ideas. Our industry has amazing thought leaders and people doing some really cool, innovative things. But when people work in silos, it's hard sometimes to collaborate and share ideas. So we wanted to provide a channel where we can all get together and collaborate and talk about ideas. So we decided actually the end of last year to make our theme for 2020, Trainwrecks, Nightmares, and Meltdowns, Tales of Lessons Learned. And little did we know that would be really, really fitting and kind of turn out to be the perfect theme for us in 2020. So each month we select a moderator, so an industry icon or leader, somebody who's doing some really cool, innovative things, and a group of practitioners who are running procurement departments, and have them share some of their train wrecks and nightmares and some of just the wild and crazy things that they've experienced and lived through. So before we kick off our panel today, I want to do a big thank you to our sponsors who make this event possible and allow us to host it every month at no cost to the procurement community. And one of those sponsors is Rapid Ratings. So Eric is with us today from Rapid Ratings. So Eric, if you could talk to us a little bit about your company and how you guys are innovating in your space.
Thanks, Sarah. Appreciate it. And thanks, everyone, for joining in. I manage partnerships for Rapid Ratings. We're happy to be a sponsor of Procurement Talks. So Rapid Ratings, we're a SaaS-based algorithmic system enabling financial health transparency between business partners and transforming the way the procurement teams manage enterprise and financial risk for public and private companies. And we're really unique because we source the financial statements for private company suppliers directly in over 140 plus countries on behalf of our clients. So we've been really busy this year with the COVID-19 downturn, helping our clients mitigate risk from those impacts. And we've been conducting various stress tests, shocking revenues on their suppliers to help them anticipate this impact. So thank you and enjoy today's discussion.
All right, Eric. Well, thank you for your partnership and for sponsoring. And I know that you'll be available in the chat if anyone has questions or wants to learn more about Rapid Ratings.
Thanks, Sarah.
My name is Sarah Scudder. I am president of Real Sourcing Network. We have a very niche solution to help companies better manage their print and marketing services spend using technology and a competitive bidding process. A couple housekeeping notes. At the bottom of your screen, you will see a chat function and a Q&A function. Feel free to engage and comment. We typically have pretty lively and fun discussions, so don't be shy. Feel free to use the chat function throughout to communicate with each other and our speakers today. There's also a Q&A at the bottom, so if you have any questions for our four panelists, John, our moderator, will be managing those questions throughout. So again, feel free to put those in. Don't save them till the end. We like to have, again, a pretty lively discussion, so put those in as your questions come up. The panel will run about 60 minutes, and John will have an open question time right at the end, and then I will close this out. So just know that from a timing perspective. And then we are recording this. This is also being live streamed, and we will make this available on demand. So don't feel free that you have to jot a bunch of notes. You'll be able to get access to the video in the next couple days if you want to go back and reference or share with your colleagues. So with that, I want to introduce our moderator today. Our moderator is John Hansen. I actually met him, I think it was November of last year. We were both speaking at a Zycus conference and he was moderating a panel. And since then we've become friends and really done a lot around sharing thought leadership and trying to build a really solid procurement community. A couple things about John that I want to share before I turn it over to him, that despite what his children think, electricity was invented before he was born. He's an avid runner who is training to break a 20-minute mark for a 5K. And I'm a runner, not nearly as much of a runner as he is, but that is not an easy task. And him and his wife had a television show called I Married the Chef. And he was actually the chef in the show. I actually had him send me an episode so I could watch. It was pretty fun and entertaining. And John wonders what chairs would look like if our knees bent the other way. So with that, I'm going to pass the conversation over to John to kick off and manage our panel discussion for today.
Well, thank you, Sarah. And I have to tell you, that's a hard question. I still don't have an answer. So anyone in the chat room, if you have an answer, please share it with me, because it does keep me up at nights, which is a problem in and of itself. Thanks so much. Now, you know what? I'm looking forward to this discussion. And, I want to get right into it and pose the first question to Jennifer. But before I do, if you could, Jennifer, maybe take about 30 seconds just to give us a little bit of background on who you are and maybe a little interesting soundbite.
Sure. Thanks, John. Jennifer Netherda, Category Manager for Procurement at Savers Value Village. Happy to be here today. Let's see, a little soundbite, little tidbit about me. You're putting me on the spot, John. Let's see, a fun fact that Sarah had asked. I used to collect, salamanders when I was younger, and I wanted to be a nun when I grew up. So how about you just, I know.
I think that beats the chair and the knees bending the other way. Salamander and a nun. I'll have to remember that. I've never had that before. All right, Jennifer. Well, now, I got to start off by asking this, because, when you talked about the not me nightmare, and I mean, yes, it got my attention right off the bat. But really, the question around this is: have you faced, or what challenges have you faced where you thought you had a pretty straightforward process and a procurement activity, and it turned out to be a little bit more complex than you had expected?
Yes, it's a little bit of a detailed story, but I'll try to breeze through it. So this is a new company that I had joined, and I had my role was within the procurement organization. And as any of us would do, just trying to get your arms around the category, right? You're reading through contracts, understanding your spend and whatnot. And my leadership had shared that this was there was a renewal that was coming up that I needed to take care of. So I'm like, easy peasy, no problem. And it was also mentioned that there was some residual inventory from a prior project that needed to be dealt with as well. So started, setting up my internal stakeholder meetings, my external stakeholder meetings, and getting my arms around the category. And the project that had taken place at the company the prior year was we had made the decision to pivot away from using plastic bags at the stores to paper bags at the stores. So of course there's the ramp down, ramp up of the inventory. And what came to light is that we had some residual inventory that quite frankly nobody was aware of, and it was really the hot potato. So the supplier was tasked with a burn down plan, if you will. So we were able to identify some paper bag suppliers or plastic bag suppliers that we could, sell the inventory on the secondary market, which the supplier did. And then at the end of the project, we knew that we were going to have some residual inventory, and the accounting team had accrued for that expense. And it was about $200,000. So we took that hit like in P12 and in P1. And then what happened in a few months later in P4 is we received a bill from the supplier for $500,000 of the remaining plastic bag inventory. So of course, this all came to, happen when I first started with the company and I started managing the space. So we had to put a halt to paying that invoice. And I really went on a fact-finding mission to pull the story together, because it became very clear that not all the players had all the same information or was working from the same sheet of music, right? So I was having meetings with the supplier to build out the timeline, all the activities that had transpired, met with the business unit, with accounting and whatnot. And, what ended up happening is that the business unit wasn't brought along, the supplier wasn't brought along in the process. And so there was just a real lack of communication. And it became clear to me that there was such a long-standing relationship. We've been doing business with the company for about 30 years, an integral part of our process. And I think everybody was just running on autopilot. So nobody was really managing the supplier, managing the space. And so we had to figure out what we were doing with that $500,000 expense, which was not budgeted, right? And it was a big surprise. And then the CFO became involved as well, just given the expense. So there was conversation about going out to RFP for this book of business, but we just didn't have the time. So we decided to move forward with a renewal instead. And as a part of that renewal, we and built out the negotiation strategy. We wanted the supplier to step up to the plate to help pay for part of that expense. So that was a long and emotional negotiation, but the supplier didn't feel that they were responsible for that inventory because we had approved all those orders to bring the inventory into the network. And so as a part of the relationship and wanting to continue that relationship, they decided to pay a contract rebate for the renewal. So it was a win-win at the end of the day. We do have a 3-year renewal in place. The supplier did step up to the plate and pay basically half of what that exposure was at the end of the day. That hit the bottom line. So the CFO was thrilled, right, that we covered half of that expense. And we were able to build in continuous improvement and savings targets and whatnot into the contract. And I think at the end of the day, the message is, you need to bring all the players along, even if the story isn't a good story and you've got $750,000 worth of inventory to deplete. You have to make sure the supplier's on the same page, you're on the same page, and you're all operating off the same page of music, right? And also having open lines of communication. That's one thing that came to light, is that the top to top weren't talking and the VP and VP weren't talking as well. So making sure that you have those open lines of communication, that when you run into a situation like that the supplier is able to call, their peer, if you will, to have those conversations. So.
Now, did that make the relationship stronger afterwards, do you think? And it helps you create that path of communication, doesn't it? Which we're in a relationship business, right?
Right. It definitely did. We had a lot to navigate through in the first few months working together, but I think our relationship is definitely stronger because of it. We do have biannual business reviews where the leadership is involved. So we do have those open lines of communication now, which is great. So it's really turned out to be a very strong relationship for us.
Great. Well, thank you, Jennifer. And, this segues nicely to you, Nick, because, and first of all, someone in the audience loves your whiteboards. It reminds them of school in the background. So there you go. But Nick, and you and I have been in the industry for a long time, some 40 years or whatever in the high tech. And listening to Jennifer's story, I mean, you're generally, and I've met you at the same conference I did with Sarah, generally speaking, you look like you're a pretty cool customer under all kinds of pressures. But what kind of situations would cause you a meltdown? What would create the problems? An example like what Sarah gave. What would really cause you to get off track a little bit?
Yeah, I can definitely answer that, and I'm going to just say the one word, wet paint, and I'm going to explain in a minute. But thanks for the intro. My name's Nick Gunn. I'm the CEO and founder of the NIVAC group. I'm the N in NIVAC, and if you want to know what the other initials stand for, go check us out on LinkedIn. But prior to branching away from the corporate world, I was with HP and HPE for 30 years. And my sort of final roles there were running the corporate services function, which included procurement and real estate and a bunch of stuff like that. But now let me come back to wet paint. So back in the late 2000s, Mark Hurd, the late Mark Hurd, was our CEO. And Mark was maniacally focused on costs. Keeping costs contained, reducing costs, and making the company as profitable as possible. And at the time, I think this must have been around 2009, and we had acquired EDS, and that made us probably a Fortune 10 company. We probably had revenue of about 130 billion, a spend of 27 billion just on the indirect side. So I was leading the procurement function. And I remember it was Friday night, and I was on my way to the cinema with my kids to watch a movie that I can't even remember what the movie was. And my IT business partner called me, and she said that Mark is on the warpath. He wants to know why we spend so much money on ISPs, in particular wet paint. And I'm like, I have no clue. Okay, so you got to think about this in terms of the size of the suppliers that we had. We're talking about suppliers that had hundreds of thousands of dollars to spend, maybe $1 million, and we've got $27 billion. We got suppliers that we were working with that had over $1 billion to spend with us. So Mark wants to know about stuff that's right down in the tail, and he wants to know about it in our meeting on Monday. So, I spent the weekend, the reason I don't recall the movie is because I think I spent the whole time in the movie thinking about what I'm going to say to Mark and who wet paint are. So, over the weekend, I got my team together. We did some research. We found out, who wet paint were specifically and who was buying them, which was more important, who was buying from them, what they were buying. And it was pretty interesting because there was a whole space of, at the time, remember, it's the late 2000s, a lot of suppliers in this ISP space. We're a big, diverse company. A lot of people are buying a lot of different things. So I went into the meeting, and one of the things that I'd learned from Mark's chief of staff at the time, a guy called Brian Humphreys, he's now the CEO of Cognizant. He always told me, when you go into a meeting with Mark, you need to be super prepared. You need to have everything that you're going to talk about on the topics and on anything else in case he brings it up. So I was super prepared, went into the meeting, and he brought up wet paint and he wanted to know about them. But more than that, he was really concerned about why we were spending money with a company that he'd done some research on that was kind of like an entertainment website. So it wasn't so much that I went into a meltdown, but there was definitely a meltdown occurring in the room at the time with the CEO of our company being very worked up about how much money we were spending with these ISPs, why we were spending the money, who was spending it. And, he literally started calling other people from his staff in to question them, because I would be bringing up, well, this is the group that's spending money. And then he would bring in the EVP of that group, just call them in from the office outside and come in, and then they would have to start. So the whole thing was turning into this group meltdown. Because nobody had the answers that he was looking for. I presented the data, but that's all I had. And nobody had the answers that he was looking for. So I definitely had a learning experience there that it's not just good enough to have the data, which I felt like I had a good handle on the data. But really, you have to be aligned with the stakeholders, understanding, okay, who's buying what and why. And even in an environment like that, where we had $20+ billion to spend, and these were suppliers that were right down at the tail end, the CEO is interested. And when the CEO is interested, you need to be interested and you need to be prepared. So I wouldn't say I quite had a meltdown, but it was pretty hot in that room. Let's just say that.
So you see the tenseness there. I guess, first of all, number one, work the problem rather than the problem working you. At least you had the data. But The dynamics in a room is certainly a big factor in that, isn't it?
It is, because when he started to call in his EVPs, and these are a level above me, and they start to get called in, you really don't want to put these guys who are your business partners on the spot and embarrass them. So it was a real kind of challenging situation, but ultimately figured out how to resolve it and get back to him with the information that he wanted. But yeah, it was definitely one of those moments when you're sweating a lot.
All right. Well, listen, thank you, Nick. And Erika, I want to go into your question, but first, if you could take about 20 seconds, 30 seconds, just to give us a little bit of background on yourself. And thanks, Nick.
Sure. Thanks, John. So I'm Erika Hallberg. I work at Voya Financial, and I manage the marketing, communications, and brand categories. I've been at Voya for about a year. And my previous experience was all in IT spend. So marketing is a brand new category for me. So definitely a learning curve.
Well, I think we're always all on a learning curve, right? You know enough to know you don't know enough. Well, you know what, Erika, listen to what Jennifer said in her story, and then Nick, in referring to this, your question is very interesting to me, because when you're under pressure and you feel that tension, it's easy to try to react to it. And what did you learn that trying to bully suppliers is not a good negotiation strategy? You know, with Jennifer's approach with the excess inventory, the pressure Nick was feeling. I mean, why is not putting the pressure on the supplier or bullying them into taking on an onerous share of something not a good idea?
So, good question. I'm glad you asked that. I learned very early in my career the method of bullying. One of my mentors and managers in a company that I worked for when I first started in sourcing, that was his approach, was bullying. We didn't have a strategy to go on. We didn't have a plan to fall back on. It was just, you're going to give us reductions and you're going to do it because we say so. So, you know, we had a large company name behind us and a lot of spend. So we had a little bit of room to be able to use that tactic. But what I saw over and over again was the damage that it caused to the relationship, the stress that it caused to the suppliers. It seemed like they were always walking on eggshells around us. They were reluctant to offer up new innovations and new strategies to do things because it would add. So it was not a great environment. We didn't have the collaboration that we could have had with our suppliers, and we didn't get some of the great ideas, industry ideas that they might have been able to share with us. So have since learned my lesson. A lot of different positions in my career, and definitely look back on that as something that did not work out well. Since I was junior to the role, there wasn't a lot of say I had, but definitely learned that's not the best approach.
Well, sometimes being able to observe rather than being put in a position of saying something is a long-term or a learning experience that you can carry with you, which is, I think, was what you're saying today, right?
Yes, exactly. I've definitely incorporated that into my strategy today, is to not be as much of a bully as possible.
Okay. Well, thank you, Morgan. Now I want to build on what we've just heard about and talked about. But if you could, Morgan, give us a little bit of introduction into yourself there.
Gandee. I'm Vice President of Global Indirect Procurement here at Belden. It's kind of a nice title to work with a great team and support a great business. But, you know, earlier in my career, I started out as an engineer and then, you know, had the opportunity to move into procurement when one of my engineering managers took a role. So about a year later, I went down and joined the procurement team, and it's been a great ride ever since. But in my spare time, which some of us have very little of these days, you know, I enjoy coaching my kids' baseball teams. My wife and I have 3 kids, so baseball, basketball, soccer, out on the field, working with people. I would say in the coaching environment, bullying doesn't work. So I kind of relate to what you're saying there, Erika. But also, I think, you know, just from some of my work experiences as well, you know, you have to earn a seat at the table. But yeah, so that's a little bit of background on myself.
Perfect. Well, that's great. Well, this sort of, after hearing Jennifer and Nick and then Erika talking, one of the questions that comes to mind is procurement is not for the faint of heart. I thought that was an interesting statement that you had in there. And what I really want to know is, based on what you're here, what you've just heard, what situations where you had to gain the trust in a challenging situation so that you could make a difference? What was it?
Yeah, absolutely, John. It's a true statement. Procurement's not for the faint of heart. You know, I think we can all relate to the fact that procurement is not always a welcome participant at the table. And sometimes our most challenging negotiations are internally versus externally with the suppliers. And I've found those kinds of situations, been in those kinds of situations in the past as well. But kind of answer your question, about 6 years ago, the company I was working with at the time, I had the privilege of working with the leader of their fleet department. So fleet was probably next to logistics, the largest area of indirect spend. And as you know, as a procurement leader, we're challenged to find opportunities to improve the process, to drive savings, to make a difference with the business. And to protect the innocent, I'll call him Dave. But in our initial conversation, it was clear that Dave had past dealings with procurement and not always on the positive side. And so in that initial conversation, which was quite memorable, he basically said, here's who I am, here's my team, here's what I do, here's how it works. And if I need your help and assistance, I'll let you know, but I appreciate you calling. And so, that was an opportunity where, let's say in Erika's experience, I could take the opportunity and just say, I'll be a bully back kind of thing and that approach, but that wasn't going to win at the end of the day. And so, with that being our second largest area of indirect spend, how do I gain this individual's trust? And so through a series of questions, I let him have his say. Obviously, he had some experiences in the past that kind of led to a train wreck, and I didn't want to be the next story in that line there. So basically, I had a series of questions I was asking him. This was my first exposure to fleet. I'm not coming in with the answers. I need to learn from this individual. And obviously, they're not that thrilled with the fact they're on the phone with me. We're having that conversation. So basically, through a series of questions, I got a chance to ask him, hey, what works? What doesn't work? Where do you see the opportunities? And I think as procurement leaders, having the right questions to ask and not always having all the answers is probably a good approach when we're working with folks that don't always want to give us a seat at the table, an opportunity to have a voice heard. So I had to really take the time with this individual to give him a chance to share from his experience, to listen to him. And as a result, we were able to, over a series of a couple months, to sit down, come up with a plan and work together on that plan that was going to, in a sense, replace about 25% of the company's fleet, drive in and provide a more environmentally friendly fleet that we would use to service the customer, because we're very much a services business. We had a fleet of vehicles, over 1,000, that were servicing the customer, keep the customer at the forefront of our minds. And that's where Dave's concern was as well. But we were able to have a great impact on the business, reduce about $1 million in expenses, provide a better fleet that's out there servicing the customer. But that wouldn't have happened, had I taken the same kind of bullying, challenging approach, because that initial conversation, quite memorable, could have easily been a train wreck and resulted in no benefit or win to the business. But just, you've got to earn that trust. And sitting down at the table, giving them an opportunity to speak, as opposed to trying to make sure you're understood, but giving them a chance to speak first and understand from them, went a long way in building that relationship.
You know what I find interesting about all these stories, and thank you, Morgan, is that you all four remind me that there are internal stakeholders with who you have to deal, both yourself, Morgan, and Nick's story. And Nick, I've got a question for you in a moment from the audience, but also the external relationships. Erika and Jennifer talking about that. I mean, sometimes, you have to have that balance of recognizing that you have internal customers and external customers. And it's interesting how all four of you bring that together into a cohesive, related story. So thanks, Morgan. Now, one quick question before we move on. Nick, in the audience, there's a question of, do you have tips for reading the room? They were impressed with how you read the room in the situation when you walked in with the CEO and the executives. I mean, what tips do you have for reading that? And I mean, Morgan, you also had been able to read the situation as well, but what advice would you give to be able to read a room better, Nick?
I think, first of all, you need to be prepared to talk about whatever the topic is in terms that are relatable, accessible, and digestible to the audience, right? So if you're talking about procurement on, like my example with the ISPs, you have to talk about it in terms that, relatable, in this case, to the CEO, because then you're going to get some engagement. So I think that's one thing. If you haven't got engagement, because they start to get distracted, they start to look at their cell phones or they're tapping away at their computer and things like that. So that when I start to see a lot of people that I work with, a lot of senior leaders they like to have paper copies of slide decks, and they start to move like pages forward. when you start to see that, then I always think, okay, move on, because they've kind of digested whatever it is that I was talking about or we're working on. So move on to the next thing. And then the other thing I find is, try to be succinct in the answers, right? Let them explore rather than, you know everything on a topic. Don't just, dump it on them. I think that would be sort of my advice on sort of how to read the room. And it's a little bit different on Zoom as well. When you're doing conferences, I've noticed that people, to varying extents, they'll be on Zoom like we are with the camera. Some people turn it off. And when people have turned the camera off, I always kind of think what their motivation is for doing that. Are they having a bad hair day? Or is it because they're focused on something else? So that becomes much more difficult to read.
All right. Well, you know what? Overall, I think the takeaway from this is whatever the situation, look outward, whether you're dealing with an external stakeholder or internal stakeholder. Let's start with Jennifer again. I want to bring you back into the flow of things, because another thing you mentioned, redundancy, resiliency reminder. And I'm going to delve into this because you talked about the fact that a single source award decision can backfire on you. In what way can that happen? What examples, Jennifer?
Sorry, John, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, thank you. So I think we can all relate to having annual cost savings targets, right? Or stretch assignments, handed down in the middle of the year. So this was when I was at Starbucks. I was in the bakery space, and a lot of contracts had come up for renewal the prior year, so the prior team. And in order to meet the cost savings targets that were outlined, the decision was made to single source award a number of the bakery items. And the bakery business at Starbucks is about $1 billion business. So in order to meet those targets, certain suppliers were just awarded 100% of the blueberry scone or the banana loaf, those types of things, right? So I was new into the space, and we were getting ready to ramp up for the fall. And one of the primary revenue drivers for the fall LTO limited time offer is the pumpkin scone. And so we were going through the process of QA, just, reviewing and approving the product. So we're starting to, build up the inventory, ramp up for the release of the product in the fall. And unfortunately, what had transpired is that the supplier wasn't meeting the spec, the QA spec. And so there was a lot of activity of, going to the manufacturing facility, seeing what we could do to help. But since we had the single source award, we had no one else to fall back on. So the supplier wasn't able to meet the demand for the LTO or the volume for the season. So we were in a mad scramble, myself and the QA team, to basically try to onboard or vet a new supplier and align so that they could help to meet that demand. And so it started a series of activities where we were de-risking the network, and we were looking at all the different products. So within the bakery space of what are the high revenue drivers? Where do we need to have a dual source in place? And so we had to categorize all the different products and where the most risk was, because since we didn't have the necessary volume, Starbucks was losing money on the pumpkin scone. And so we had to quickly identify, a supplier, get them qualified, get the product qualified. And so it was a tough conversation with the supplier that we awarded the business to, because they had provided the pricing based on 100% of the volume, right? So we were able to shave off about 25%, move that to another supplier. They were able to help to meet the demand. And so then it became this chessboard or, movement of all these different, 25% here, you've got 75%, just to try to make people whole with 100%, if you will. And so that was our strategy for the following year, is just to de-risk the network and put the dual supply in place, which was a partnership with the category team and with the QA team, because in some instances we would be seeing a cost up and not a cost saving. So it's just a reminder after that activity it was a painful process because we had the single source award and, a lot of pressure because we weren't meeting the numbers because of the supplier, the throughput and whatnot. So it's been a reminder for me in my career is to have that secondary supplier in place, and sometimes a tertiary. And that even came up, with the PPE with my current, company today as well. Having the secondary and the tertiary has really helped so that we're not in a bind like that again. So.
See, the visual I get from that story, Jennifer, is like trying to pack your suitcase while trying to catch a train that's leaving the station. You got to respond on the fly. I'd be interested, it is a great subject to investigate a little further did that turn you off single sourcing in the future? Like you mentioned, you got a secondary and tertiary, but it gave you a broader perspective in terms of not putting all your eggs in the proverbial single basket.
Correct. I have not done that since. Yes.
Well, Nick, now hearing what Sarah had to say, Nick, can you give an example of a relatively straightforward procurement? Because obviously a single source, you do it because it's straightforward, it's easy, you have a reliable relationship. But with your own example, turned into a train wreck for you, and what lesson would you take?
Okay, I've got an interesting one here. This example actually spans 3 CEOs. Okay, so my straightforward procurement took quite a long time, and it was again, back in the sort of 2000s, HP was acquiring a lot of companies, and we'd acquired, as I mentioned previously, EDS, and we had a large travel spend. Okay, well over, I think it was it was well over $1 billion at the time. And what was interesting was we were using different platforms. So HP essentially was using a Concur platform, and EDS were on the Get There platform. And my boss and everybody, they wanted to save money and get everything on one platform and have not just travel booking, but all the expenses all on a single platform to make it simpler for our travelers, save some money, etc. So sounds like a relatively straightforward thing, you think. But we had this thing called balance of trade. And balance of trade, just for our audience members out here, for us as a tech company, was something we always had to consider with any suppliers. Are they customers of ours? Are they big customers of ours? Okay, what is the impact going to be on them? So we're not talking about reciprocity here. We're just talking about understanding the situation. So it turned out that the Get There product was owned by, I believe, a company called Sabre at the time. And Sabre was a huge customer of our enterprise services group, like billions of dollars of revenue. So my simple procurement turned into a nightmare, because what I had to deal with now was a whole business unit of sales guys that didn't want any impact on their customer by us moving spend from them to another vendor. That was one thing. Secondly, internally, we had our own homegrown expense tool that bolted onto Concur. And the group that developed that, which wasn't IT, by the way, were very reticent about relinquishing control of their expense tool and replacing it with sort of industry standard off-the-shelf product. So I had this thing going with internal group not wanting to replace the expense portion, and a business group that didn't want to change out the supply because of the impact on revenue. And this thing cycled. I'm telling you, it went from, Mark Hurd was the CEO. He left. We got this other guy, Leo Apotica, for a year. He left. We still had this thing going on when Meg Whitman started. And we did eventually resolve it, but it was very challenging. One of the things we ended up having to do was really understand from a business perspective, not just how much revenue the business was getting from the vendor, their customer, but what that meant in terms of profitability, because every dollar that we saved was 100% improvement to the P&L. Whereas if they were getting, let's say, 10% operating profit on the revenue, then to get $1 of profit that we could save, they'd have to generate $10 of revenue. So we really had to start digging into the P&L of the actual account to understand what the financials meant, what the impact was going to be. And then ultimately we came up with a solution that met everybody's needs. We replaced a lot of the Get There product and brought in the expense side of the equation. And then we kept Get There for certain parts of the business, because it made sense to do that. So it wasn't an ideal situation, but we had to work on a compromise. And all of that was internal work that had to be done. These weren't negotiations with the supplier. This was all internal work that had to be done to overcome these obstacles, get everybody on the right page. But it was very challenging, and it truly was a sort of train wreck, a nightmare, if you like, for me, because the thing just went on and on and on, and I never thought we would get it resolved.
Well, you know, it's interesting, Nick, and before I move on to Eric, and there's a question from the audience here. Listening to these stories, oftentimes when you're going through it, you feel like you're the only one living it, and it's not happening to anyone else. But when you hear these stories from you and Erika and Morgan and Jennifer, you realize we're all going through it. And it just popped in my head, what an amazing job procurement professionals do, because no one realizes that this goes on behind the scenes, do they?
They don't.
Quick question from the audience. Any thoughts on what would supply chains of the future post-COVID world look like? That's a question that just came up, Nick, as you were talking.
Supply chains of the future. I think that's a really interesting one. I think there is definitely, and I'm not talking about travel specifically, I'm just talking generally. I think there is a desire to de-risk some of the supply chains by moving some activities back onshore, back to the US, back to North America, where there's a bit more control. I know there's a lot of disruption with some supply chains earlier in the year when COVID first started. I think Apple, for example, they had problems shipping phones because a lot of them were manufactured in China and the Far East. So I think there's definitely a move that way. I think the other thing that's really key is that companies are also now looking at their costs again. Good companies that were previously very, very profitable are now looking at their costs because they see potential, they see threats to revenue. And you've got companies out there right now. I mean, I think about like the airline industry, for example. They were doing well for quite a long time, and I think they spent lots of their profits on share buybacks. And now, because the travel industry has suffered, they are now in a situation where they're going to the government and they're wanting handouts. I think maybe they should have been looking to, retain some of that profit for a rainy day. So I think overall supply chains and procurement are really having to pivot to sort of risk mitigation these days as well.
Well, and this sort of leads, and Erika, I want to lead into this. Thank you for that, Nick, because it talks to the complexity of the world in which we're dealing with. And Erika, in your standpoint, what was your first complex negotiation, and why was it a train wreck, or why would it lead to the train wreck?
Sure. So it's pretty complicated. I'll try to streamline it a little bit. I worked for a healthcare company, and we acquired another company, which brought us to about 70,000 employees. And what came along with that IT space to kind of synchronize our contracts between the two companies to be able to synergize, get rate synergies on rate cards, write up new MSAs, come up with new service level agreements, come up with new tiering discounts and all the things that go into the contract. So again, this was at the same place where I was relatively new in my career. And we were given guidelines by an outside consulting firm of what we needed to achieve with each one of the suppliers, and basically talking points on how we should go about achieving that. So without much input into that, we were put into the situation where we had to negotiate with each supplier these different contract terms. So it became very convoluted, as you can imagine, with trying to synchronize everything between two companies, trying to keep one vendor engaged because they didn't have any business with the new company, but yet we could dangle that in front of them that they may potentially get some new business. And then having a third party telling us how we should negotiate it, and then throwing in a little bit of the bullying, I'll go back to that, fire in. And it just became a train wreck. It turned from a 3-month, a 90-day timeline
into almost 10 months. And when I left the company, it was still going on. The negotiations were still going on. So we had really damaged the relationships. But not only that, we had lost a good amount of savings that we could have achieved had we reached some sort of interim agreements in the beginning. We lost all that money over the 10-month period that the negotiations were going on. So very complex, did not come to a good ending, unfortunately. Learned that I need to definitely, when we have a consulting firm involved that's giving us direction, need to be a little bit more upfront with my ideas and suggestions rather than just following what they say, because we really know the suppliers better than they do. So again, not a great outcome, but lessons learned. Like that's the theme for mine, is lessons learned each time. So yeah, that was definitely it. That was a train wreck for everybody.
I'm thinking of agility and adaptability. I mean, Jennifer, what you're talking about with the pumpkin spice, and Nick in terms of this. Going into you, Morgan, and thank you, Erika. And going into you, Morgan, I mean, people talk about change can be scary and it's never easy. And you've got to reinvent yourself or think on your feet a little bit. I guess agility and adaptability is the key. How are you leading change within your organization in terms of incremental value, in terms of responding? Some things are a crisis or an acute situation. Some things are more longer range, but change and adaptability, I think, remain relatively constant, don't they?
Absolutely, John. And if I can, just to answer kind of the question that was posed here in the chat window, what is procurement going to look like, let's say, post-COVID world? I would say companies are going to continue to go down the digital transformation path just to make that tactical work process more streamlined. Again, I'm happen to be in the office today, which is great, but I know a lot of people are working remote. So in having to work remote, we need tools and technology to support that kind of environment. But I also would say we're probably going to have and should have more cross-functional teams, more collaboration, not just necessarily with our business partners, which I talked about a bit earlier, but also as a procurement team on a global basis. So the needs I have here in the States might align with the needs we have in Europe or APAC, and being able to, as a team, work together cross-functionally, and how do you support each other's businesses through a COVID kind of situation. I see that increased. I saw that as a result of COVID within our business. And so I kind of think those kinds of things are here to stay, more cross-functional collaboration, as well as on the digital side, making it easier for us to work in a remote kind of world. So.
All right.
Yeah, but to answer your question, change is scary, and who wants it? But, the things that are certain are death and taxes and change. It's always going to be here. But when I joined Belden about 4 years ago, there was discussions already underway about how do we digitally transform the procurement function. We had limited visibility to spend. Yeah, we could get reports from IT and finance and say, what do we do here? What do we do there? But that's always a historical look back, and you have no influence to change your direction and where you're going as an organization. And so within about the first 8 months, the decision was made, and I think we actually met as well at the Zycus conference. We made the choice to deploy the Zycus technology and head down that digital transformation, and that's scary. You're taking, in our case, a mainly paper-based process, and then trying to put that through an online digital kind of process. And, you can meet a lot of resistance along the way. And we had some of our businesses that had their own tools. So how do you say, stop using that tool? Now we're going to use one Belden tool. But I think there was a few key decisions that we made to avoid, disasters down the road. One of the things we did is we branded it. So we called it B-Pro, Belden Procurement. And I think that helped drive some ownership, not only within our team, but also with the business. Who's going to sit back and say, well, I don't want to use this because it's this company. Oh, no, that's our company. So, it helped drive some ownership of this change that was coming through that's scary, really, to a lot of folks. But I think then in how we approach the business, because, there was definite concern. So if you think about it, a lot of communications, we developed a communication plan, and it was key to kind of relate their current world to the new world. How do I'm so used to doing what I do today. What does that look like if I jump on board the train and head down your path? And so, through a communication plan that was targeted at kind of relating to individuals about here's how you currently work to how you're going to work in the future, that was key. A lot of meetings with internal stakeholders and walking them through the process and the tool. And again, continuing those conversations, not just in email, because we know folks learn differently. Some people are very audio based. Some people are very written based. They have to read it. And then there's a mixture of in between. So as we approach this change, to avoid the nightmares, we had different approaches there. On-site training. Now, obviously that's, a bit challenging in the days of COVID, but, so we have to move to web-based. And to Nick, your comment, hopefully the screens stay on and folks are engaged through the process. You really don't know. But I think that just one-on-one interaction with end users is so key and helpful. And hopefully it can be as effective in a digital space, but sometimes it's hard to read the room or to measure that. Then having champions locally that can support that business. We can't be in all places at all times. But if we can have key individuals at that location, at that business that users can connect with or in the same time zone, that helps through driving that kind of change. And then just making sure you're there and available to users after the change. So now that they're in a digital world, no longer paper-based, being able to connect with them and just have those regular touch points so you keep a pulse on what's going on within the business. I think those are key things that we've seen be successful. I would say, for sites where we didn't get a chance to go on site, it's been a bit more challenging. You learn a lot when you're there interacting one-on-one with end users that you don't get the opportunity to do when you're in that remote setting. So you've got to kind of up your game a bit and try to pay more attention and engage more in a remote setting when you can't be on site and interact in a more personal way. But, that's kind of what I've experienced, what I've seen, and how to avoid some of the train wrecks and nightmares that come along with driving change, because it is a scary process.
See, now it's interesting, Morgan, the feeling is that there is the process for change and process drives change. Process is the key linchpin, which kind of is interesting. And Jennifer, I'm going to go back to you here based upon what Morgan had just said. The 20-year train wreck. You come up with such great terms there. I love that.
I had to come up with something catchy for Sarah.
Well, you certainly did. And, one of the things is procurement process. I mean, we follow these processes. Right. You have an example, I bet, of a time when procurement best practice wasn't followed. And what was the impact on that regard?
Sure. So somewhat similar to the first example I had shared. It was started with a new company, same company, started with a new company, getting your arms around your category and whatnot. And this is a supplier that I was responsible for. And we've been doing business with them for 20 years. And what I had quickly found, when trying to read through contracts, understand your spend, is that we didn't have a contract in place. The supplier. And this is one of those suppliers that's an integral part of the process. They are actually a fabricator, manufacturer, and they help to build fixtures, if you will, in the front room, the back room, knows our stores, knows the layout, knows how the operation works. And so the real estate and construction team rely heavily on this supplier, as we didn't have the resources, if you will, and outsourcing that work to them. So the conversation, what I had learned from others, in my internal stakeholder meetings, is that procurement had tried to put an agreement in place with the supplier for a very long time. But it just never came to fruition. And so that was on my to-do list, right? And so it literally took a year to put an agreement in place for US and Canada. And so that was a huge win, a champagne lunch when that actually happened. But the impact was we actually had a product that was manufactured by the supplier, and we didn't have the agreement in place, as I had mentioned. But unfortunately, we were identified. So the company was sued. I'm not going to go into all the details, but the company was sued because of this product that we purchased from the supplier. but we didn't have the agreement in place. We didn't have the indemnification in place, if you will, right? So we ended up going to court. We ended up settling for a sizable fee. But had we had the agreement in place, we would have been able to point back to the supplier and have that indemnification. So that's a lesson learned. And the story that I like to share is, when I hear from business units that are, we got to get moving, we don't have time for the contract, Jennifer, we don't have time for the contract. I always like to share an example. And this is a good example to share of this is what happens if you don't. And we need to build the time into the timeline so that we can have the contract in place and start off the relationship on the right foot. So.
Well, and it's interesting. And Nick, I'm going to get you on here because there's a tie-in to Sarah or to Jennifer's. But one of the questions that came up from the audience, Jennifer, was curious to know your views on establishing the right balance between retrieving investment and supporting our suppliers through this crisis. I mean, the balance. How do you achieve that?
So can you say that or frame that up a different way, John?
Question. Okay. Establishing the right balance between retrieving investment and supporting suppliers through the crisis. Like, how do you balance supplier interest and supporting them and finding that balance?
All right, I got to think about that, John. Can we go to the next question? Sorry.
Okay, think about that. We'll get back to you. Okay, we'll get back to you shortly with that. And it's open that question to any of the other panelists as we progress through here. Nick, process and sticking with process. You've been involved with a lot of mergers and acquisitions in your time. And I guess, as you look at that, did any acquisition or divestiture create a real nightmare for you and your team that you can recall?
In their own way, they all did. But there were certain nightmares that large acquisitions in particular would cause. And I'm thinking about, think about, we're taking two companies and we're kind of merging them together. So you have a lot of stuff that's duplicated. So companies are acquired. Typically, we would acquire companies because they were either tuck-in acquisition or they gave us some intellectual property or something like that. We did not acquire any company because we wanted their back office. We didn't acquire companies because we want their real estate or their IT or anything like that. We wanted something that was of revenue generating value. But you get all of the back office stuff. So you typically have two IT departments, and those IT departments buy software from exactly the same companies. So there was one particular occasion where we had two large IT departments that we were trying to push together. And from a procurement perspective, we've got a lot of spend on the contracts, and we got some very, very large, who shall remain nameless, IT software suppliers. And their view of our acquisition or merger is that they are going to take what they have with the revenue they get from both companies, and they're going to grow their revenue. Obviously, our perspective is different. We want to shrink the amount we're spending with that company. So we had a particular challenge working with this very, very large 800-pound gorilla of a software company to convince them to renegotiate a single deal that would span the sort of newly integrated IT departments of the company. And the challenge, one of the biggest challenges with that was that both us and the acquired company had what we call sort of all-you-can-eat at the time. They were all-you-can-eat enterprise-wide license agreements. So it's the all-you-can-eat buffet of software. And then what started to happen was you started to get new products coming out. So, for example, things like Salesforce and Workday would come out. So if you could imagine, if I use the buffet analogy, we bought the buffet, but we decided we wanted to get our appetizer from somewhere else and our dessert from somewhere else. So that's going to increase our costs. But obviously we didn't want to do that. So then you're trying to negotiate with a company where you've got an all-you-can-eat agreement to say, well, actually, I don't want all-you-can-eat. I want to take some things out of it. And they didn't want to do that. We were constantly hit with, no, that's not possible. So then what we had to do was change our approach to say, okay, instead of us buying this all-you-can-eat agreement, which, by the way, is very convenient when you're a large company that can't count software licenses, to something that's much more specific and directed, where we start to work with the IT group and say, well, actually, how many licenses do you need of this product? How many subscriptions to this SaaS product do you need? And it starts to become a much more complex and challenging process, because now you're asking for people to do something that they're not resourced to do. And when you're in a large company and you've got literally thousands of servers where licenses are sitting on them, and you have to start counting, you have to start finding out what people actually need, that process kind of takes a lot longer, becomes a lot more complicated. But ultimately, it did drive for the company. We didn't get all the way to Bright the first go. We didn't get to where we wanted to get to, because the complexity was just significantly more than we originally anticipated. But that's one of the, if you like, the nightmares that you get when you're trying to acquire large companies and get them integrated. When you're sitting on the procurement side or any of the sort of back office functions, the goal typically is get these things integrated, make sure they work smoothly, and save some money.
Well, it's interesting, Nate. Let's go back to that question, Jennifer, that I was posing to you as well. Is I guess what the audience member is asking is, as I'm listening to this, there's a lot of things to balance simultaneously, whether it's a merger or acquisition, whether it's adhering to process, etc. I mean, how do you find that balance? And Jennifer, I'll go back to you before I go to Erika. How do you find that balance, Jennifer, between serving the supplier's needs and interests while still being true to what you have to be able to do, delivering the value to your organization?
Well, I think, part of that comes down to strategy and, you need to meet with your internal stakeholders. What are their goals? What are we trying to achieve? And then, how does your strategy ladder up to execute and meet those needs? And so you have to fold in, those supplier needs as well that they can, execute too. So I think it comes down to those conversations, relationships, having those, meeting with your internal, external stakeholders, and trying to strike that balance as a part of that strategy and executing against it.
Okay, well, holding that and building on that, and Morgan, you mentioned you can comment on that balance as well. And Erika, I haven't forgotten about you yet, because I think there's something very interesting here about early lessons and being able to deal with that. Morgan, what are your thoughts with regards to the question?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think it's going to vary depending on the type of supplier and situation you're dealing with. For some suppliers that are more transactional based, I think you need to have an awareness of what's going on, but it's not as crucial to the business. For your more strategic suppliers, if they're having, let's say, a financial challenge, in a sense, we might be co-destiny partners. And so their success is going to drive our success in business. And so having a closer relationship with them, having the right discussions at the right level within the organization can help you de-risk or at least manage through those challenging times like we're facing these days.
All right. Now, Erika, this is where you're going to come into the picture here, because early procurement experiences, and you referred to a couple of stories early on and learning life lessons perpetually. And we all do. In terms of your early procurement experiences, how did they shape your approach and philosophy? Let's drill down a little bit further for that.
So definitely have learned a lot, like I said, from my previous experiences. I've also gotten some really good mentors along the way that work both in procurement and not in procurement. And one of my great mentors has been Sarah. So thank you, Sarah. I've learned to take a step back and look at the supplier relationship and the company needs and balance those a lot better, come up with a more clear strategy than just going in and saying, well, we want this discount just because we want it, because we deserve it. So coming up with strategies with my stakeholders and having a cohesive approach to the relationship, to the negotiation, to what we want to achieve out of the negotiation. I can't stress how much I've learned in the past few years about how to develop strategies, especially in difficult situations where we seemingly have no leverage. But when we talk through the scenario with the stakeholder, we come up with something that we do have. So I am learning also quickly, I'm in a new category now. So being in IT for so long, now switching to marketing is a completely different animal. You're looking at completely different ways of paying for services, completely different types of terms and types of relationships. So I've definitely learned that you're always learning, that all the training that you can get is helpful, that participating in these panels from both sides is always helpful, and that you should always be nimble on your feet and be agile and be willing to adjust your strategy and adjust your approach as needed to satisfy your customers and your suppliers.
See, it comes down to process balance, agility, and adaptability. And I think this leads to the final question to you, Morgan. What's the best advice you'd give to somebody who's new for procurement or is thinking about procurement as a career?
Yeah, good question, John. And maybe just to hit off of something that Erika was just talking about, having those conversations with your internal stakeholders, those brainstorming sessions. I think, we don't always have all the answers, but when we get together with our business partners, we can come up with some great ideas. But I would say, reflecting back as well on some of my earlier comments, just take time to listen and understand. A lot of times we want to be understood. You need to understand from my perspective, but I think it's more important for us to sit back and listen and absorb and understand from other people's perspectives before trying to be understood. And hey, we're given 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. So I just kind of use that as a reminder to myself that, make sure I'm taking the time just to listen. But I think once you've taken that time to listen, you understand, you can learn from each other, and you guys can accomplish great things together as a team. For each of us, we work and support our companies. And, one of the sayings we have is we have one Belden. And I'm sure each of the panelists here would kind of agree that we're all supporting our company. We should all be rowing in the same direction. But I would just add to this, I wouldn't say don't worry about taking credit for the win. I would much rather, let's say, give that credit back to the business, because at the end of the day, as much as we are about procurement professionals, we're building relationships through the process. And those relationships that we build today are going to give us an opportunity to have more success in the future. And we want to be trusted advisors to the folks that we work with in the business. And so let them take the credit, take time to listen and understand. And I think that'll be key to having a successful career. I didn't start out as a procurement professional. I don't even think they had that as a degree when I was back in college. So I'm a recovering engineer that's in procurement. But that would be my words of advice there. So, well,
Morgan, Nick, Erika, and Jennifer, thank you so much. Sarah, I see the prompt is the end of our time together has come, although I could talk to all of you for another hour. Maybe look at extending the show an extra hour, Sarah, but great insights from all of you. Thank you so much. And I'll turn it back over to you, Sarah.
John, before we close out, I see that behind you, you're promoting your new show. Do you want to tell us quickly about the CPO Arena?
Absolutely. The CPO Arena, and thanks for that, Sarah. CPO Arena, if you've ever watched Shark Tank or Dragon's Den, CPO Arena is the very same premise except for the procurement world. And what we do is each episode we bring in a service provider or an innovative technology relative to procurement. And before 5 top CPOs, industry thought leaders, they present their story as a company, do a demonstration of a key feature and functionality, open Q&A, and they literally, I guess the best way to put it is present their story and get the assessment from CPOs in our business by procurement for procurement framework. And following the segment, which is 30 minutes, synopsis highlighting what each CPO thought of each solution. We're very excited about it because we think it gives a great opportunity, another perspective on what's out there from, again, a procurement standpoint.
And John, if you want to put the link to the CPO Arena in the chat in case anyone who's joining us today is interested in checking out one of the shows, I'm sure that you not only have them live, but they're recorded so people can check out some of the past editions.
They are indeed on demand, and I would be very happy to do that. So thank you for that, Sarah. Okay. Here is the link coming up in a sec.
All right, thank you. So Nick, Morgan, Erika, and Jennifer, thank you all very much for sharing your thoughts and insights I think sometimes we learn our best lessons from storytelling and from other people's challenges and mistakes, so we can take those back to our careers and our leadership experiences and become better at what we do and better leaders ourselves. John, thank you very much for moderating our panel today. I know that you speak at a lot of events and have a busy schedule, so I appreciate you making the time. Our event is being recorded. Again, we will make this available in the next few days. We will send out a link to everyone that registered. We'll be sharing it on social, so you'll be able to access this content and share it with your colleagues as well. Our next procurement talk is December 9th from 1 to 2:30 Eastern Time. So if you are interested in attending our PTalk next month, you can go to our website, rsnetwork.com, and register. Brandon will also send out a registration link when he sends a recording for this event. So with that, good morning, evening, or afternoon, depending where you are in the world. And thank you all again for joining us, and go back and make procurement cool.